Before we begin, a word. Every voice you are about to hear could belong to a real person, and the next one could be yours. Flame apart and read it aloud at footnotesandfolly.click. Good evening, and welcome back to Footnotes and Folly. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and this is the sixth part of John Lord's Ancient States and Empires, his sweeping schoolmaster's survey of the whole ancient world, given here in plain modern English from Lord's own public domain text. The plain rendering and the asides are mine. Last time we saw the little nation of the Jews come home from Babylon, raise its temple a second time, and throw off the Greek yoke by the swords of the Maccabees. But the priest-kings could not keep their crown clean. They fell to quarreling, and tonight the quarrel opens the gate to Rome. We shall watch Pompey march up and storm the Temple Mount, and a crafty half-foreigner named Herod climb over the wreck of the old royal house to a throne of his own. Herod, who to flatter his subjects rebuilt their temple in a splendor that outshone even Solomon's. And it is in the reign of this very Herod, Lord reminds us, in a stable at Bethlehem, that the greatest event of all human history quietly takes place. Then the story darkens. The Roman governors, Pontius Pilate among them, Herod Antipas, who murdered John the Baptist, the endless feuds of Pharisee and Sadducee and Zealot, and at the last a mad, magnificent, hopeless revolt against the whole power of Rome, which ends under the towers of Titus in famine and fire and the utter ruin of the city and the temple. Lord asks us always to look past the pomp for the providence. Let us keep that in view and begin.
Another family now came forward, and it eventually took the crown from the Asmodean princes. Antipater, a noble Idumean, was the chief minister of the weak Hyrcanus. Driven by ambition, he urged the deposed prince to reclaim his rights. Following his advice, Hyrcanus fled to Aretas, king of Arabia, whose capital, Petra, had become a great center of commerce. Aretas, Antipater, and Hyrcanus marched with an army of 50,000 men against Aristobulus. Aristobulus was defeated and fled to Jerusalem. At this time Pompey was continuing his conquests in the east. Both parties asked for his help, and both offered immense bribes. This powerful Roman was then at Damascus, receiving the homage and tribute of eastern kings. The Egyptian monarch sent him a crown worth 4,000 pieces of gold. Aristobulus, who controlled the riches of the temple, sent a golden vine worth 500 talents. Pompey, intent on conquering Arabia, made no decision. After he had achieved that object, he adopted a haughty manner that could not be reconciled with the independence of Judea. Aristobulus, patriotic but wavering, too high-minded to submit and too weak to resist, fled to Jerusalem and prepared to defend it. Pompey came near the capital, which had been weakened by the constant divisions among the latter Jews arising from their zeal in religious disputes. The city fell after a brave defense of 3 months. It might not have fallen if the Jews had been willing to relax their strict observance of the Sabbath, while the Romans prepared their assault. Pompey tore down the city's defenses and imposed tribute, but he spared the treasures of the temple, which he profaned by entering it as a heathen. He appointed Hyrcanus to the priesthood, but withheld the royal diadem and restricted Hyrcanus's dominions to Judea. He took Aristobulus to Rome to adorn his triumph. Aristobulus escaped, however, and with his son Alexander renewed the civil conflict. He was captured again and sent once more as a prisoner to the Eternal City. Gabinius, the Roman general, for Hyrcanus had called on the Romans for aid, now stripped the high priest of royal power and reorganized the entire government of Judea. He established 5 independent Sanhedrims in the chief cities, modeled on the great Sanhedrim that had existed since the captivity. This arrangement remained until Julius Caesar restored Hyrcanus to the highest dignity. Jerusalem was now exposed to the greed of the Roman generals who truly ruled the country. Crassus plundered everything that Pompey had spared. He took 10,000 talents from the temple, about $10 million, when gold and silver were far more valuable than they are in our time. These enormous sums had been gathered from the gifts of Jews scattered across the world, some of whom were immensely wealthy. Aristobulus and his son Alexander were assassinated during the great civil war between the followers of Caesar and Pompey. After Pompey's fall, Caesar confirmed Hyrcanus in the high priesthood and allowed him to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But Antipater, taking advantage of Hyrcanus's incapacity, resumed his ambitious intrigues. He managed to make his son Phasael governor of Jerusalem, and Herod, another son, governor of Galilee. Herod showed great ability and waited for his opportunity. After the Battle of Philippi, he made welcome offerings to the victorious party and received the crown of Judea. Judea had recently been ravaged by the Parthians through the intrigues of Antigonus, the surviving son of Aristobulus. By marrying Mariamne, who belonged to the royal line of the Asmoneans, Herod strengthened the power he had gained by the sword and by Rome's favor. He was the last independent sovereign of Palestine. Herod ruled as a tyrant and committed great crimes. He caused the death of the aged Hyrcanus, and imprisoned and executed his wife on a base suspicion. He paid Augustus the same court that he had paid Antony, and Augustus confirmed him in possession of his kingdom. The last of the Asmonean line had died on the scaffold, Beautiful, innocent, and proud, she had been the object of boundless passion to a tyrant who sacrificed her to an even stronger passion, suspicion. Torn between love and resentment, Herod fell into violent remorse, for he had been more or less involved in the murder of the father, grandfather, brother, and uncle of his beautiful and commanding wife. Even amid the splendors of his palace, he was haunted by the image of the wife he had destroyed and loved with passionate ardor. He burst into tears and tried every diversion, banquets and revels, solitude and work. Yet the murdered Mariamne was always present to his excited imagination. He settled into a fixed and indelible gloom, and his stern nature turned toward cruelty and bloodshed. On the whole, his public administration promoted the peace and happiness of the country, although he introduced the games and theaters in which the Romans found their greatest pleasures. These innovations exposed him to constant danger, but he overcame it by vigilance and energy. He rebuilt Samaria and erected palaces. His greatest work, however, was the building of Caesarea, a city of palaces and theaters. His policy of reducing Judea to a mere Roman province did not please his subjects, who suspected that he intended to heathenize the nation. Neither his generosity nor his severity could silence the complaints of an indignant people. Their open hostility led him to take a measure that he hoped would win them over forever. The pride and glory of the Jews was their temple. Herod decided to rebuild it with extraordinary splendor, so that it might approach the magnificence it had possessed in the time of Solomon. He removed the old building, worn down by sieges, violence, and 500 years of use. The new structure gradually rose, shining with gold and impressive with marble pinnacles. Yet despite all his magnificent public works, whether meant to satisfy his people's pride or his own vanity, despite his efforts to develop the resources of the country he ruled by Rome's favor, and despite his talents and energy as one of the ablest monarchs ever to sit on the throne of Judea, he was hateful to his subjects because of his cruelties and sympathy with paganism. In his later years he was afflicted by a terrible disease that racked his body with pain and filled his soul with suspicion. His court was also torn by plots within his own family, which poisoned his life and led him to commit unnatural cruelties. He had already executed 2 favorite sons by Mariamne, whom he loved, all because of court intrigues and jealousy. He then executed his son and heir by Doris, his first wife, whom he had divorced in order to marry Mariamne. The circumstances were so cruel that Augustus said he would rather be one of Herod's swine than one of his sons. Among other atrocities, Herod ordered the massacre of the innocents, so that no one might be born as king of the Jews. His final act was to give the fatal order for the execution of his son Antipater, whom he had hoped to make his heir. Almost immediately afterward, he died in agony, hated by the nation and leaving a name as infamous as that of Ahab B.C. 4. Herod had married 10 wives and left a large family. In his will, he named the sons of Malchus, his 6th wife and a Samaritan, as his successors. They were Archelaus, Antipas, and Olympias. The first received Idumea, Samaria, and Judea. Galilee and Perea were assigned to the second. Archelaus immediately took control at Jerusalem. After giving his father a magnificent funeral and the people a funeral feast, he entered the temple, sat on a golden throne, and made the kind of conciliatory address monarchs commonly make. He promised reforms and relief from taxes and oppression. Yet this did not prevent one of the shameful uprisings that had always marked the people of Jerusalem. Religious hostility caused it, and 3,000 people were killed. After putting down the riot with soldiers, he went to Rome to secure confirmation of his throne. There he faced intrigues from members of his own family and the emperor's changing will. His younger brother, Antipas, also went to Rome to support his own claim to the throne under an earlier will. While the claims of the royal disputants were being decided before the highest tribunal of the civilized world, fresh disturbances broke out in Judea because of the greed of Sabinus, the Roman procurator of Syria. The entire country fell into anarchy. Adventurers came from every direction to press their claims among a people who eagerly hoped for national independence, or for the rise of some conqueror who would restore the foretold glory of a land then torn by civil conflict and stained with the blood of brothers. Varus, the prefect of Syria, tried to restore order and crucified about 2,000 leaders of the disturbances. 500 Jews went to Rome to petition for the restoration of their ancient constitution and the end of kingly government. At last, the imperial decree confirmed Herod's will. Archelaus was appointed ruler of Jerusalem, Idumea, and Samaria, with the title of ethnarch. Herod Antipas received Galilee and Perea. Philip, the son of Herod and Cleopatra of Jerusalem, was made tetrarch of Iturea. Archelaus ruled his territories with such injustice and cruelty that the emperor removed him, and Judea became a Roman province. The scepter finally passed away from the family of David, the Asmoneans, and Herod. The kingdom became a district dependent on the prefecture of Syria, although a Roman governor administered it. The history of the Jews after Herod's death is marked by the greatest event in human history. 4 years after he died in agony, pain, and remorse, Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem. His teachings have changed the whole condition of the world, and will continue to change all institutions and governments until the seed of the woman has completely triumphed over every wile of the serpent. We cannot enter into the life or mission of the Savior, or into the weak beginnings of the early and persecuted church that he founded and that is destined to go on from conquering to conquering. We return instead to the more direct history of the Jewish nation, until its capital fell into the hands of Titus and its political existence was destroyed. The Jews were now to be ruled by Roman governors, or by mere vassal kings whom the Romans allowed and protected. The first of these rulers was P. Sulpicius Quirinius, a man of consular rank. As proconsul of Syria, he was responsible for the government of Judea, which was entrusted to Coponius. M. Ambivius succeeded him, and Annius Rufus succeeded him. Ambivius. Governors changed quickly until Tiberius appointed Valerius Gratus, who remained in office 11 years. Tiberius acted on the principle that rapid changes of rulers increased the people's oppression, since every new governor tried to make himself rich. Tiberius was a tyrant, but he was a wise emperor, and the affairs of the Roman world were never better managed than in his reign. Like the Herodian kings, these provincial governors appointed and dismissed the high priests, leaving them to manage the internal affairs of Jerusalem. The governors generally lived at Caesarea, avoiding the disputes of the Jewish sects and the tumults of the people. Pontius Pilate succeeded Gratus in AD 27. During his memorable rule, Jesus Christ was crucified and slain. Pilate was cruel, stern, and careless of human life, but he cared about the province's peace and quiet. He tried to send the innocent prisoner to the tribunal of Herod, since as a Galilean he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction. But Pilate gave way to the people's demands and left him to the mercy of the Jewish priesthood. Pilate's watchful fear of popular disturbance, along with his reckless disregard for human life, led to his recall. Yet during the 40 years since Herod's death, his sons had quietly ruled their separate provinces, Antipas at Sepphoris, the capital of Galilee, and Philip beyond the Jordan. Philip was humane and just. He died without issue, and his territory was joined to Syria. Herod Antipas was a different kind of man. He seduced and married his niece Herodias, the wife of Herod Philip, daughter of Aristobulus, and granddaughter of Mariamne, whom Herod the Great had sacrificed through jealousy. She was the last descendant of the Asmonean princes. It was on her account that John the Baptist was put to death. This marriage proved disastrous, because it involved Antipas in trouble with Aretas, king of Arabia and father of Antipas's first wife, whom he had repudiated. Antipas ended his life in exile at Lyons. Through the intrigues of Herod Agrippa, Herodias' brother and therefore a grandson of Herod the Great and Mariamne, Antipas had provoked the jealousy or hatred of Caligula, the Roman emperor. The Herodian family, of Idumean origin, was never free from shameful quarrels, jealousies, and rivalries. The territories of Herod Antipas passed to Herod Agrippa, who had already received from Caligula the tetrarchate of Iturea after Philip's death, together with the title of king. Fortunes of this prince, in whose veins flowed the blood of the Asmoneans and the Herodians, exceeded in romance and change any recorded of Eastern princes. He was by turns a fugitive and a favorite, a wanderer and a courtier, a pauper and a spendthrift, according to the changing hatred and favor of the imperial family at Rome. He had the good fortune to be Caligula's friend before Tiberius died. When Caligula took the throne of the Roman world, he brought his friend out of prison and disgrace, gave him a royal title, and granted him part of his ancestors' dominions. Agrippa did all he could to prevent Caligula's mad plan to obtain divine religious worship from the Jews, and he was moderate in his rule and policy. When the Roman tyrant died, his successor Claudius gave Agrippa the investiture of all the territories that had belonged to Herod the Great. He ruled with great splendor, respected the national religion, observed the Mosaic law with great care, and sought the people's favor. He inherited his great ancestors' taste for building palaces and staging theatrical performances. He greatly improved Jerusalem and strengthened its defenses, though he was only a vassal king. He ruled by Rome's favor, depended on Rome, and feared Rome, as other kings and princes of the earth did, for the emperor alone was supreme. Agrippa stained his good reputation by persecuting the Christians. He died in the 44th year of his life, after ruling 7 years over part of his dominions and 3 over all Palestine. He died in extreme agony from internal pain, being eaten of worms. He left 1 son, Agrippa, and 3 daughters, Drusilla, Berenice, and Mariamne. The first 2 daughters married princes. At his death, Judea again became a Roman province. His son, Agrippa, was only 17 years old and too young to govern a people as turbulent, unreasonable, and stiff-necked as the Jews. They were divided by continual feuds and party hatreds, traits that seemed to have marked them ever since the captivity, when they permanently renounced idolatry. What were these parties? Their beliefs, struggles, and quarrels form an important part of the internal history of the Jews under both the Asmonean and Idumean dynasties. Pharisees were the strongest and most numerous party, and the most popular with the nation. The beginnings of this famous sect are obscure, but it probably arose soon after the captivity. They were the Orthodox party. They held firmly to the law of Moses in its smallest observances, and to every tradition of their religion. They were earnest, fierce, intolerant, and proud. They believed in angels and immortality. They were brave and heroic in war, but stubborn and domineering in peace. They were great zealots, devoted to making converts. They lived austerely and despised everyone who did not. They were learned, proper, and excessively concerned with rules. Their dogmatism knew no rest or softening. They believed in predestination and in the bondage of the will. In public they displayed their piety. They made long prayers, fasted strictly, carefully kept the Sabbath, and paid tithes even on the cheapest herbs. They claimed superiority in society and always took the highest seats in the synagogue. On their foreheads and the edges of their garments they displayed strips of parchment inscribed with sentences from the law. They were regarded as examples of virtue and excellence, yet they were hypocrites regarding the weightier matters of justice and equity. Naturally, they were the bitterest enemies of the faith Christ revealed, and were always found among its persecutors. They resembled the strictest Dominican monks of the Middle Ages. They were the favorite teachers and guides of the people, whom they stirred up in their various seditions. They were theologians at the height of legal Judaism. They surrounded their law with safeguards intended to prevent every possible violation of its commands. Through skillful and technical interpretation, they found rules that favored their own purposes. They developed asceticism into a system and observed the most painful ceremonies, becoming the ancestors of rigid monks. They joined a plausible casuistry, like that of the Jesuits, to excuses for violating the spirit of the law. They were a hierarchical caste whose ambition was to govern through legal technicalities. They utterly lacked humility and toleration, and for that reason were especially offensive to the great teacher when he taught the higher law of love and forgiveness. Outwardly, however, they were the most respectable and honorable men in the nation, dignified, proper, and careful of appearances. The next great party was the Sadducees. They sought to restore the original Mosaic religion in its purity and remove everything tradition had added. But they lacked a deep sense of religion. They denied immortality and therefore all punishment in a future life. They made up for denying the future by strictly punishing every crime. They taught belief in divine providence, by which every crime was thought to be avenged in this world. Their party was less popular than that of their rivals, but it included men of high rank. Like the Pharisees, they upheld the strict Jewish code and professed great moral uprightness. Yet they had no true, deep religious life, and were cold and heartless in disposition. Most were wealthy and comfortable men, satisfied with earthly enjoyments and inclined to the Epicureanism found among many Greek philosophers. They did not escape the hypocrisy that disgraced the Pharisees or their bitter opposition to the truths of Christianity. Besides these two great parties that controlled the people, there were the Essenes. They lived apart from others in the deserts around the Dead Sea and feared cities as breeding places of vice. They allowed no women within their settlements. Their numbers were increased by strangers and converts who regarded every pleasure as sinful. They shared property in common and condemned the desire for riches. They wore white garments that they never changed and ordered their lives by the severest rules. They abstained from animal food and lived on roots and bread. They worked and ate in silence and observed the Sabbath with great exactness. They were serious students, strict in morals, and believers in immortality. They hated oaths, slavery, and idolatry. They accepted Oriental philosophy and believed that matter was evil and mind divine. They were mystics who delighted in abstract contemplation. Their theosophy was lofty, but Brahminical. In practice they were industrious, ascetic, and devout, the forerunners of those monks who fled human dwellings and filled the solitudes of Upper Egypt, Arabia, and Palestine, the loftiest and most misguided of Christian sects in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But the Essenes had no direct influence over the people of Judea, as the Pharisees and Sadducees did, except by encouraging obedience and charity. All these sects flourished at the death of Agrippa. Judea was thereafter governed directly by Roman governors. Cuspius Fadus, Tiberius Alexander, then Titius Cumanus, Felix Portius, Festus Albinus, and Gessius Florus governed in succession over this discontented province. Their short administrations were marked by famines and tumults. King Agrippa, meanwhile, held only nominal power and lived in Jerusalem in the palace of the Asmonean princes, which stood on Mount Zion toward the temple. Robbers filled the country, and murder and robbery were constant. High priests were appointed and removed. The people were burdened with taxes and provoked by plundering. Wild and dreadful signs filled the land with fear of coming calamities. Fanatics alarmed the people. Christians foretold the ruin of the state. Never had a population of 3 million people been more discontented and oppressed. Outrage, injustice, tumults, and insurrections marked this doomed people. The governors were insulted and in revenge massacred the people. On one occasion Florus killed 3,600 people in AD 66. Open war was clear to the more discerning. Agrippa vainly urged moderation and reconciliation. He showed the people how useless resistance would be against the overwhelming power of Rome, which had conquered the world, and that refusing tribute and destroying Roman fortifications were open acts of war. But he spoke to a doomed people. Every day brought new causes of discord. Some among the higher orders wished to act prudently, but the people in general were filled with bigotry and fanaticism. One day some of the boldest men in the war party seized the fortress of Masada near the Dead Sea, built by Jonathan the Maccabean and fortified by Herod. They put the Roman garrison to the sword and raised the banner of revolt. In Jerusalem, the blinded people refused, as was customary, to receive the gifts and sacrifices offered in the temple to the God of the Jews by foreign rulers. This was an insult and a declaration of war, which the chief priests and Pharisees vainly tried to prevent. Urged on by zealots and assassins, the insurgents set fire even to the palace of the high priest and that of Agrippa and Berenice. They also burned the public archives, where creditors' bonds were kept, and thus destroyed the power of the rich. They then captured the important citadel of Antonia and stormed the palace. A fanatic named Menahem, son of Judas of Galilee, openly proclaimed that it was impious to recognize any king but God and treason to pay tribute to Caesar. Because he was the most unscrupulous and zealous, as so often happens in times of excitement and passion, he became leader of the war party. He entered the city with the splendor of a conqueror and became captain of the forces that took the palace and killed its defenders. The high priest Ananias was stoned while trying to restore order. Dissensions then arose among the insurgents themselves, and Menahem was killed. Eleazar, another later, continued the siege of the towers defended by Roman soldiers. The towers were taken and the defenders massacred. Meanwhile, the Greeks killed 20,000 Jews in Caesarea. This drove the nation mad and caused a general insurrection in Syria and bloody conflict between the Greco-Syrians and the Jews. Disturbances arose everywhere with wars and rumors of wars, and men fled to the mountains. Wherever Jews had settled, there were disturbances and massacres, especially at Alexandria, where 50,000 bodies were piled up for burial. Nero was now on the imperial throne, and severe measures were taken to put down the Jewish revolt. The Jews had been driven to desperation by the memory of their oppression, and by the belief that every man's hand was against them. Sergius, the prefect of Syria, advanced with 10,000 Roman troops and 1,300 allies, and desperate war now seemed unavoidable. Agrippa, knowing how disastrous this would be for the Jewish nation, tried to prevent it. He argued with men who were blinded by their passion. Sergius tried to storm Jerusalem, the headquarters of the rebellion, but failed and had to retreat after losing much of his army. It was a defeat such as the Romans had not suffered since Varus had been overwhelmed in the forests of Germany. Judea was now openly rebelling against the whole power of Rome. It was a wild and desperate revolt that could end only in the political ruin of the nation. Great preparations were made for the coming struggle, in which the Jews would fight alone and without allies. The fortified posts were held by the insurgents, but they had no organized or disciplined army, and they were divided among themselves. Agrippa, the representative of the Herodian kings, openly supported Rome. The Jews could hope only in their stern fanaticism, stubborn patience, and daring courage. They could justify their revolt by all the principles that inspire oppressed people seeking freedom, and they had the glorious example of the victories of the Maccabees. But their misfortune was that they had to fight the armies of the masters of the world. They were not strong enough to revolt. News of the revolt and of the defeat of a Roman prefect caused deep concern at Rome. Although Nero pretended to treat the matter lightly, he chose Vespasian, the empire's ablest general, and sent him to Syria. The conflict began in Galilee, whose mountain strongholds the Jews entrusted to Joseph, the son of Matthias. He was directly descended from an illustrious priestly family, and had the blood of the Asmonean in his veins. He was a cultivated and learned man, a Pharisee who had first opposed the revolt but joined it after the defeat of Sergius. He is better known as the historian Josephus. His defensive measures were wise and energetic, and he tried to unite the various parties in a struggle he knew was hopeless. He raised an army of 100,000 men and introduced Roman discipline, but party quarrels and treachery hindered him. In Jerusalem, Ananias, the high priest, took the lead, but he had to contend with fanatics and secret enemies. The first important event of the war was the unsuccessful expedition against Ascalon, 65 miles from Jerusalem, where Roman discipline defeated superior numbers. Soon afterward Vespasian advanced to Ptolemais, while Titus, his son and lieutenant, sailed from Alexandria to join him. Vespasian had an army of 60,000 veterans. Josephus could not fight this force openly, so he strengthened his fortified cities. Vespasian advanced carefully in battle order and halted at the borders of Galilee. The Jews under Josephus fled in despair. Judea was the first city to fall, and its inhabitants were put to the sword. This was a harsh punishment the Romans often inflicted to frighten their rebellious enemies. Josephus withdrew to Tiberias, without hope and discouraged, and urged the people of Jerusalem either to reinforce him with a powerful army or to submit to the Romans. They did neither. He then entered Jotapata, where the strongest Galilean warriors had entrenched themselves. Vespasian advanced against the city with his entire army, drew a line of circumvallation around it, and began the attack. The city stood on the summit of a high hill. It was difficult to reach and well supplied with provisions. As the Roman works rose around it, the defenders raised its walls 35 feet. They also made sallies and fought with the courage of despair. The city could not be taken by assault, so the siege became a blockade. Though the besieged had provisions, they came out from behind their fortifications and destroyed the Roman works. By skill and invention they destroyed the terrible battering rams of the besiegers. Catapults and scorpions swept the walls, and the huge stones began to strike the turrets and towers. Triple lines of heavily armed soldiers surrounded the whole city, ready to attack. The Jews tried every kind of expedient, even pouring boiling oil on the heads of their assailants. Angered by their stubborn resistance, the Roman general adopted more careful methods. He raised embankments and fortified them with towers, placing slingers and archers in them, whose missiles struck the defenders of the walls with terrible effect. For 47 days the brave defenders resisted all the resources of Vespasian. At last they were exhausted, and their ranks had thinned. Once more the whole army made a furious assault, and Titus climbed the walls. The city fell, with the loss of 40,000 men on both sides. Josephus surrendered himself to the will of God, but the victors spared him because of his skillful flatteries, in which he predicted that Vespasian would rise to the throne of Nero. It would be interesting to recount the progress of the war, but space does not allow it. The reader is referred to Josephus. One city after another gradually fell into the hands of Vespasian, who then established himself in Caesarea. Joppa shared the fate of Jotapata. The city was destroyed, but the Romans fortified the citadel. News of these disasters filled Jerusalem with alarm and mourning, for scarcely a family had not lost some of its members. Tiberias and Taricheae, on the shores of the beautiful Lake of Galilee, fell next, followed by terrible massacres, as was common in the warfare of that age. Galilee stood horrified, and every city except 3 surrendered. Of these, Gamala, the capital, was the strongest and even more inaccessible than Jotapata. It was built on a precipice, crowded with fugitives and well supplied with provisions. But it too was finally taken, along with Gischala and Idumean, and all Galilee was in the hands of the Romans. Jerusalem, meanwhile, was torn by factions and internal conflict. It could have strengthened the fortresses of Galilee, but instead it gave itself to party hatred, which weakened its power. If the Jews had been united, they might have made a more successful resistance. But their fate was already decided. I cannot describe all the intrigues and factions that paralyzed the nation's strength and warned the inhabitants of their coming ruin. Meanwhile, Nero was assassinated, and Vespasian was raised to the imperial throne. He sent his son Titus to complete the conquests that had so far resisted his victorious legions. In those days of danger and anxiety, Jerusalem was still divided by factions and neglected its last opportunity to organize its forces against the common enemy. No city was ever less aware of its approaching ruin. 3 separate parties fought one another, shedding each other's blood without regard for consequences, hardened, fierce, and desperate. At last the army of Titus came to besiege the sacred city, which was still strong and well supplied. 4 legions, together with mercenary troops and allies eager to avenge earlier losses, camped beneath the walls. They destroyed the orchards, olive groves, and gardens that had brightened the beautiful countryside around the city. Jerusalem was protected by 3 walls wherever impassable ravines did not defend it. These walls were not one inside another, but enclosed separate districts. They were immensely strong. In some places the stones were 35 feet long and so thick that even the heaviest battering rams made no impression on them. 164 towers rose above these massive walls. One was 140 feet high and 43 feet square. Another, made of white marble, was 76 feet high. It was built from stones 35 feet long, 17.5 feet wide, and 8.5 feet high, fitted together with perfect masonry. Within these walls and towers stood the royal palace, itself surrounded by walls and towers just as strong. The fortress of Antonia, 70 feet high, stood on a rock 90 feet high, whose sides were steep and sheer. Above all these towers, hills, and fortresses stood the temple. It stood upon an esplanade forming a square furlong on every side. The walls surrounding this temple fortress were built of enormous stones and rose to a great height. Inside these walls, on every side, ran a spacious double portico 52.5 feet wide. Its exquisitely carved cedar ceiling rested on marble columns 43 and 3/4 feet high, each cut from a single stone. There were 162 of these beautiful columns. Within this quadrangle was an inner wall 70 feet high, enclosing the inner court. Inside that court was another, still more splendid portico, entered through bronze gates decorated with gold. These doors or gates were 52.5 feet high and 26.25 feet wide. Each gateway had 2 lofty pillars, each 21 feet in circumference. The gate called Beautiful was 87.5 feet high, made of Corinthian brass and covered with gold. The quadrangle, entered through 9 such gates, enclosed another court, within which stood the temple itself with its glittering front. This third and innermost quadrangle was entered through a gateway tower 132.5 feet high and 43.5 feet wide. From a distance the temple appeared like a mountain of snow adorned with golden pinnacles. With what feelings Titus must have looked upon that glorious building, when the rising sun above Mount Moriah shone on its gates and pinnacles, so soon to be completely destroyed, until not one stone remained upon another. Around the doomed city Titus built towers that looked down upon the walls, and from them he hurled destructive missiles. His battering rams struck at the weakest parts of the walls. The first wall was soon abandoned. 5 days later, after a furious battle, the second wall was broken through, and Titus took the lower city, where most of the people lived. The steep heights of Zion, the Tower of Antonia, and the temple still remained. Although their cause was hopeless, the Jews would not listen to terms of surrender. Titus used every possible means to persuade them. Josephus did the same, addressing the people from a safe distance. Their most stubborn rage was joined to proud and empty confidence, perhaps along with complete distrust of enemies whom they had offended beyond forgiveness. At last famine bore heavily upon them. No grain could be bought. The rich hid their food. Every kindly feeling disappeared in the common misery. Wives snatched the last morsel from their families, and exhausted husbands and children took it from their parents. The houses were filled with the dying and the dead. A heavy silence lay over everyone, yet no one complained. They endured in grim darkness and despair. From the 14th of April to the 19th of July, A.D. 70, between 100,000 and 500,000, according to differing estimates, were buried or thrown over the walls. A measure of wheat sold for a talent, and people searched the dunghills for something to eat. When everything was prepared, the assault began on the places still holding out. On the 5th of July, the fortress of Antonia was captured, and the siege of the temple was pressed. Titus made one more effort to persuade its defenders to surrender, because he wished to save the sacred building, but they would not listen and remained obstinate. They kept fighting inch by inch, exhausted by famine and driven to despair. They chewed their leather belts and ate even their own children. On the 8th of August, the wall enclosing the portico or cloisters was scaled. On the 10th, the temple itself, a mighty fortress, fell with all its treasures into the hands of the victors. The soldiers looked with admiration at the gold plates and the delicate workmanship of the sacred vessels. Everything that fire could destroy was burned, and all who guarded the precincts were killed. Alice and the upper city still held out. Titus promised to spare the defenders' lives if they surrendered at once, but they continued to demand terms. In fury, Titus swore that the whole surviving population would be destroyed. Not until the 7th of September was this final stronghold taken, so stubbornly did the starving Jews defend themselves. Then indiscriminate slaughter began, until the Romans grew tired of their work of vengeance. During the entire siege, 1,100,000 were killed and 97,000 were made prisoners, because a large part of the population of Judea had sought refuge within the walls. During the whole war, 1,356,000 were killed. Thus Jerusalem fell after a siege of 5 months, the most desperate defense of a capital in the history of war. It fell never to rise again as a Jewish metropolis. No city had ever suffered greater misfortunes. Never had heroism been joined with greater fanaticism. Never had a prophecy been fulfilled so plainly. The fall of Jerusalem was followed by bloody battles before the whole country was finally conquered. With that final conquest, the Jews were scattered among the nations, and their nationality came to an end. Their political existence was destroyed. The capital was ruined, the temple torn down, the royal house extinguished, and the high priesthood buried beneath the ruins of the sacred places. With the occupation of Palestine by strangers and the final scattering of the Jews through all nations, we leave this subject, so full of sorrowful interest and solemn lessons. Without a country and without friends, they kept their institutions, their religion, their name, their distinct qualities, and their associations. The student of history should see in their prosperity and their misfortunes the overruling providence that fulfills his promises and the awful majesty of eternal laws.
And so the holy city that had outlived Assyria and Babylon and Persia and Greece is thrown down at last, its temple burned, not one stone left upon another, and its people scattered to the ends of the earth, just as, Lord does not fail to note, had been foretold. Mark what he sets before us: a nation destroyed less by the legions without than by the madness of faction within, tearing itself to pieces even as the enemy raised his ramparts, and yet a nation whose one true glory the coming, in its midst and in its due hour, of the Prince of Peace no fire could burn and no conqueror carry away. Here the long eastern half of our story closes. The great river kingdoms, the trading cities, and the covenant people have all had their day. Next time, in part 7, we cross the water at last into a wholly new world, the mountains and islands and bright quarrelsome little cities of Greece, the birthplace of free institutions, of philosophy, and of the arts that still shape our own. Thank you for keeping the story with me. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly. One last thing before you go. There is a part on our stage still wanting a voice, and it may as well be yours. Come and read for us at footnotesandfolly.click, and be in the next telling rather than only watching it. And before the lamp goes out, a small request. If something tonight taught you, or surprised you, or simply delighted you, do leave a comment and tell me what it was. And if there is a work, an author, or a tale you should like me to take up next, set it down there as well. I read every one, and many an episode has begun its life as a viewer's suggestion. Until next time.